The prairie wind didn't knock. It never had. It just came and went, howling through hollow bones of dead fences, lifting the porch dust into swirls like ghosts rising, then falling again into silence. That silence was the only companion Elias Boone had kept for 14 years. His boots struck dry dirt as he hauled split firewood into the lean-to. The sky above was an iron sheet, stretching wide and cold. A storm was building, the kind that made animals go quiet and reminded men how small they truly were. But Elias had no one to tell that to. He hadn't spoken to a soul in weeks. He lived in the last house before the desert forgot names. A crumbling white ranch house with a sagging roof, 3 graves out back, and a rocking chair that hadn't moved since the day his wife died. The house was too quiet, too clean, too hollow. He swept every morning. Not for pride. Just habit. Like breathing. Like regret. Once, they'd said he was a man of action. Rode with rangers. Shot Comanche clean off their ponies. But war was the kind of thing that left you empty even if you survived it. And Elias hadn't really survived. Not all the way. The firewood landed with a thud. His hands were calloused, thick, yet trembling. Cold was setting into his bones early this year. He lit the hearth, then the oil lamp, watching its amber light stretch long shadows across bare floorboards. Then he heard it. Not a knock. Not a voice. Just a hush so total, so strange, that even the wind seemed to pause. He stepped out onto the porch. The storm clouds had thickened like bruises across the sky. There, just beyond the gate, stood 10 figures. Barefoot. Still. Silent. Girls. Elias narrowed his eyes, not sure if he was dreaming. His mind, once sharp as a steel trap, had grown soft in places. But no, they were real. 10 Comanche girls, covered in dust and sun, standing like ghosts at the edge of his world. Not one of them spoke. The oldest among them stepped forward. Her dress was torn, her long dark hair matted. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her eyes didn't beg, but they didn't threaten either. Elias stared. Then said the first words he'd spoken aloud in 2 weeks. "You lost?" The girl blinked, then gave the faintest shake of her head. Her voice came soft, cracked by thirst. "We won't stay long." He looked at them all 10. From the eldest to one who couldn't have been older than 8. Thin arms. Cracked lips. One carried a wrapped bundle that might have been a doll. Or not. All of them watching him like deer unsure whether the rifle was raised. He looked at his barn. He looked at his house. He looked at them again. He didn't nod. Didn't smile. Just turned, walked to the barn door, and opened it wide. "You'll find straw inside. Water pumps out back," he said. Then he walked back to his porch without another word. The wind returned as he sat. They moved like shadows, single file, disappearing into the barn without a sound. Later that night, as the storm broke over the plains and thunder rattled the windows, Elias watched the barn lantern flicker from inside the slats. The rain fell hard, drumming on the roof like war drums, and he remembered another night, long ago, when Comanche torches lit the sky and his wife clutched their baby and whispered a prayer too late. The cradle had stayed in the house long after the child had not. He didn't sleep. At dawn, he made coffee and bread. His hands worked without needing his mind. He carried the bundle down the porch steps and left it at the barn door. When he turned to walk away, the eldest girl was there. She hadn't spoken again. She looked at the bread, then at him. He nodded once, then walked off toward the corral to feed the horses. The days passed like that. Quiet. Routine. The girls never asked for more. They took water, cleaned the barn, shared everything in silence. Once, he saw one of them brushing the horse with a piece of worn cloth. Another time, he found wildflowers placed on the graves behind the house. He didn't know what to do with that. The town noticed. A rider passed by and spotted small feet at the well. Another saw dark hair disappear into the trees near the river. Whispers rose. Folks in Dustwater didn't like questions without answers. They liked Comanche even less. Sheriff Delaney rode up 3 days later. Wary, not angry. "Boone," he said, dismounting slowly, "you got company?" Elias met him at the fence. "I got no trouble here." Delaney scratched his beard. "I didn't ask if you did. Just saying, some folks talking. Say you're harboring runaways. They're not bothering anyone." "No, but they ain't ghosts either. People see what they want to see. Girls like that, they stir up old hurts." Elias looked toward the barn, then back at the sheriff. "They'll move on soon." Delaney studied him a long moment. Then, softer, "You're not the same man I remember." Elias didn't answer. He hadn't been that man in years. That night, as dusk rolled in like fog, Elias lit a lantern and hung it on a crooked nail outside his front door. It glowed warm against the gathering dark, casting long shadows across the porch. From the barn, the girls watched. One of the youngest pointed. The eldest said nothing. But her eyes lingered on that light a long, long time. And in that silence, the wind came again, not howling, but softer this time. As if curious. As if it, too, had waited years for someone to open a door. The barn wasn't meant for people. It smelled of old hay, dust, and forgotten winters. The rafters groaned like old men with secrets, and the floor was uneven with memories worn into the wood. But the 10 girls moved through it like it was a temple, sweeping corners, folding cloth, sharing dry biscuits in silence. No one complained. No one cried. Even the smallest among them carried herself with a solemn dignity. Elias Boone watched from the window as they washed their feet at the pump one morning. The eldest girl, who had still not offered a name, stood with her sleeves rolled high, scrubbing the dirt from the youngest's arms. Her own hands were cracked and red, her dress stained in places that spoke of travel, not shame. They weren't sisters by blood, but something in the way they moved told him they had chosen one another. Refugees bound not by birth, but by what they'd survived. He wondered what they'd seen. What they'd run from. And why they had chosen him. One afternoon, he found a carved bird on his porch rail. Rough but careful. No note. Just the bird wings spread, as if it was about to take off into the wind. Elias picked it up and turned it in his hand. The grain of the wood was warm, the cuts precise. Someone had spent hours on it. He glanced toward the barn. That night, he left a second blanket at the door. He didn't expect anything in return. But when he stepped onto the porch the next morning, a small woven bracelet waited on the railing made of horsehair and twine. It was too small for his wrist. It wasn't meant to be worn. It was a gesture. Their language wasn't words. He went into town only once that week for flour and salt. At the general store, silence followed him in. Men leaned off the counter. A woman clutched her child closer. No one said it, but everyone knew. Elias Boone, the ghost of Dustwater, had company. And they were brown-skinned, barefoot, and breathing. Behind the counter, old Mr. Leland pretended to wrap up his purchase slow. Then, too loudly, "Heard you've got yourself a full house these days, Boone." Elias didn't look up. "Just need salt. Some folks say it ain't decent. A man alone out there with 10 Comanche girls? Ha!" He spat the word like it tasted bad. Elias met his eyes. "They ain't bothering you." "They don't have to," another voice said behind him. "It's the principle." Elias said nothing more. Paid, turned, and left. The ride home was long and bitter. The sky burned orange over the canyon as the sun began its slow descent, but even that beauty couldn't soften what had settled in his gut. The town had made its decision. He would never belong again, not that he ever had. That evening, a soft knock came at his back door. When he opened it, the eldest girl stood holding a clay cup. She handed it to him. Inside was stew, thin, but warm. She didn't wait for thanks. Just turned, bare feet whispering against the porch. He watched her walk the long path back to the barn. The wind tugged at her hair. She didn't turn around. He didn't eat the stew that night. He placed the cup beside the carved bird on the shelf, as if those things alone could mark time differently. The next day, one of the girls, 12, maybe 13, collapsed in the barn. She was burning with fever, her breath shallow and panicked. The others gathered around her like petals closing around a wound. Elias stood helpless in the doorway, unsure what to do. The eldest turned to him. "She needs medicine." Her voice was steady. It was the first time he'd heard it since their arrival. Her eyes didn't plead. They simply asked. Elias nodded. He saddled the horse and rode before thinking it through. The sun was dipping low again. The ride into town took almost an hour if the wind wasn't against you. By the time he reached the clinic, the sky had gone from gold to deep violet. Dr. Sims stepped out onto the porch, wiping his hands. Elias explained, short and urgent. "Fever. Young girl. Needs quinine." The doctor blinked slowly. "This a settler child?" "No." "Apache?" "Comanche." Dr. Sims shook his head. "Ain't my jurisdiction." Elias stepped forward. "She'll die." The doctor shrugged. "Then I guess the Lord's will is being done." Elias didn't reply. He turned on his heel, hands clenched tight, and didn't stop walking until he reached the back of the clinic. He knew the layout. Once, long ago, he helped build it. The window gave easily. The cabinet inside hadn't changed. Quinine. Liniment. Dried willow bark. He took only what was needed and rode back under a sky now heavy with stars. He arrived home past midnight. The barn was quiet except for the sound of shallow breathing. He handed the medicines to the eldest girl. She didn't ask where they came from. She only nodded, then turned back to her task. The fire inside the barn flickered low. The girls had lined the floor with straw and made a pillow from old cloth sacks. The sick girl was cradled there, her skin pale and damp. Elias stepped back and let the door fall closed behind him. He stood in the yard a long time, watching the frost gather along the fence rails. The next morning, the fever broke. He found Mourning Dove, he had begun to call her that in his head, braiding the sick girl's hair while she slept. There was something fierce in her gentleness. The kind of love that didn't declare itself, only showed up and stayed. Later, when he returned from the creek, he found the carved bird had been moved from his porch to the barn's outer beam. It faced the house now. Watching him. Like it, too, was waiting for something to change. And maybe, in some way, it already had. The frost clung longer than usual that week, lining the edges of the water barrel and crusting the windows like lace. Elias Boone rose before dawn as always, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside to feed the animals. But that morning, he paused. The barn door was ajar. Inside, the scent of boiled herbs hung in the air. Mourning Dove was seated beside the fire pit, coaxing a slow heat beneath a blackened kettle. The sick girl, small and fragile, now rested beneath layers of patched cloth. She was sleeping. Breathing. Healing. In the corner, Elias noticed something he hadn't seen before. A cradle. It was hand-woven, low to the ground, no bigger than a feed sack. Made of willow branches and cloth, wrapped tight with a mother's care. It rocked gently, though it held no child. One of the younger girls, no more than 9, crouched beside it, humming softly. The tune was sad. Older than language. Elias felt something tug in his chest and backed away. That night, as the lantern light flickered across his porch once more, he sat holding a tin cup of warm milk, watching the barn like a man afraid to blink. He remembered the cradle that had once been in his own home. His wife had made it with linen she'd traded 2 hens for. They'd painted it blue together. That child hadn't lived past the first snow. He had never built another. The next morning, the girls were already outside when he stepped out. Raking the yard. Washing clothes in a tin basin. Mourning Dove stood on the porch with a broom in her hands, sweeping the boards with long, even strokes. He watched her for a moment. "You don't have to do that." She didn't look up. "It's what we do. We clean what's been dirted." He almost spoke again, but the words stayed stuck behind his teeth. She glanced at him then. Her face unreadable, her eyes deep as canyon shadow. He stepped past her and went to mend the chicken coop. The days came warmer after that. The sick girl rose to her feet and began singing to the cradle again. Another carved bird appeared on the porch rail. And one morning, Elias found fresh beans growing in the garden that had long since gone to seed. The girls had planted them in silence. They weren't passing through. They were nesting. And he didn't stop them. It was the first time since his wife's death that he let another soul touch the inside of the house. Mourning Dove stepped through the threshold slowly, brushing her hands clean before placing a bowl of cooked roots on his table. The others stayed near the door, nervous, half hovering like birds unsure if the wind would turn. But he said nothing. Didn't raise his voice. Just nodded and let them eat. He watched the youngest carefully that night, the one with the cradle. She carried it even now, tucked under one arm, protective, as if something invisible still lived inside. When she caught him looking, she didn't flinch. She simply set it down beside her and patted it gently. That cradle wasn't for the dead. It was for memory. For hope. For the children they still dreamed of. By the week's end, he'd cleared out the bunkhouse. A space once used by ranch hands now smelled of soap and cedar. He replaced the broken windows and fixed the hinges. Laid blankets. Carved pegs for hanging clothes. A second home, just across the yard from his. "I'll need help feeding the calves," he said to Mourning Dove one evening, not quite looking at her. "And I could use someone to fetch water." She nodded once. No questions. No thanks. They worked side by side for 3 days. She never wasted words. She knew how to brace a fence post and how to bleed a chicken. She had a quiet way of guiding the others with a glance or a touch. And Elias began to understand, these girls had not escaped, they had endured. One night, as a soft wind stirred the grasses, Mourning Dove sat on the porch sharpening a broken knife. Elias joined her without speaking. After a long silence, she said, "We ran from a mission compound. Said it was a place for orphans. It wasn't. He didn't ask for more." She added, "Some of the girls were taken. The rest of us left before we could be." He nodded slowly. "I figured you should know," she said. "I do," he said. The next day, the town sent word. Sheriff Delaney arrived on horseback, reins loose, hat low against the sun. His horse stomped nervously as he dismounted. "Town's restless," he said. "A few men are stirring up trouble. Talkin' about protecting the county. You know how this place gets when it starts chewing on its own tail." Elias leaned on the fence post. "They coming?" "Maybe. Not yet. But they're watching." Elias looked toward the barn, then the bunkhouse. "They're just children. They're Comanche. That's all most folks see." Elias nodded. "Let 'em come." Delaney sighed. "I'll stall 'em if I can." When the sheriff rode away, Elias turned back toward the house. The sun was dipping. Smoke curled gently from the bunkhouse chimney. Laughter rang faintly through the evening. And from the porch rail, the carved bird now faced the open prairie, its wings lifted slightly by the breeze. That night, he found the cradle moved. It now sat on his porch beside the rocker. Empty still. But waiting. Always waiting. The wind changed that morning. Elias knew it before he saw the smoke. It came in dry and sudden, humming through the grass like a warning. The sky, once pale and clear, now glowered with a strange yellow cast, as if the sun had been drawn behind parchment. He stood at the edge of the corral, jaw set tight, watching the horizon. A red smear rising in the west. Brush fire. At first, it seemed far off. But fire in these lands never walked, it ran. It had no master, no mercy. All it needed was a gust, a spark, a single decision made too late. Elias turned to the bunkhouse. Morning Dove was already outside, braid slung over one shoulder, scanning the sky. She didn't ask. She didn't panic. She simply moved. They'd been through worse. That was her look. "We'll need to cut a line," Elias said, grabbing the shovel. "Back of the field. Clear everything downwind." She nodded. The other girls followed fast, wordless and sure. Together, they dug into the hard soil, scraping back grass, breaking roots, clawing at the land to make a wound wide enough to stop flame. Elias hadn't worked like that in years. His lungs ached. His arms burned. But none of them stopped, not the youngest, not the eldest. When the wind shifted again, the smoke rolled over the hills like a wave. Cinders fell like tiny birds, glowing orange before they vanished. The fire came. It moved with a growl, seizing dry brush and fence rails. It jumped the creek like it didn't care water was there. The heat came so fierce, Elias felt his eyebrows singe even yards away. They formed a line: buckets, wet cloth, sand. One girl flung a sheet over a chicken coop and doused it again and again. Another beat out sparks with a wet coat. Morning Dove moved through it all like a soldier born of the earth, quick, silent, fierce. Her palms blistered, but she didn't cry out. Then came the moment Elias had feared. The hay barn caught. The roof groaned as fire licked through its bones. Inside were the feed, the tools, the stored winter hay. If it went, the ranch would not survive the next cold season. Elias ran toward it without thinking. But Morning Dove reached it first. She vanished into the smoke with a soaked cloth tied over her mouth. Elias screamed after her, heart hammering, but the wind took his voice. For a moment, she disappeared into flame. Then, stumbling, coughing, she emerged with a yoke and the last feed bag slung over her shoulder. The side of her skirt was scorched black. Her hands were red, raw, trembling. Elias caught her, held her upright. "You should have left it," he rasped. Her voice cracked. "You would have gone." The barn collapsed behind them, wood snapping like bones. But the fireline held. By dusk, it was over. Smoke rose in tired spirals. The wind was ash-sweet and silent. The girls sat scattered on the dirt, faces smudged, arms scratched, dresses torn. Some were crying. Some were laughing. One had begun humming again. Elias leaned against the fence post, exhausted, clothes soaked through with sweat and smoke. Then came the riders. 5 of them. Men from town. Their coats were clean. Their boots polished. And their eyes cold with purpose. One carried a folded paper, as if law could be tucked into a pocket. Another wore a silver badge pinned too proud on his chest, though Elias knew he was no sheriff. The horses kicked up dust as they neared. Boone, the leader, called, "We're here for the girls." Elias didn't move. "They're wards of the state now," the man continued. "Feral, endangered, unaccounted for. You harbor 'em, that makes you liable." Elias straightened, though his legs screamed. "They're not property," he said. "They're not yours. They're not yours either." Behind him, the girls were rising slowly. Morning Dove stood at the center of them, one hand resting gently on the shoulder of the youngest. "She's bleeding," Elias said, nodding toward Morning Dove's arm. The man snorted. "They bleed. So do coyotes. Doesn't mean they belong in town." The wind kicked up again, rustling the prairie with a dry whisper. "We're talking them," the man said, reaching for his reins. Elias stepped forward. "You'll try." The man's smile disappeared. "You want a fight?" Elias didn't answer. He walked to the porch, lifted his old rifle from its hooks, and rested it gently across his arms. He didn't point it. Didn't need to. From the yard, Morning Dove spoke. "Ask them." Her voice was clear, steady, scarred. The man turned, confused. Ask them, she repeated. Ask if they want to go. One by one, the girls stepped behind Elias. No one screamed. No one ran. They simply stood, shoulders squared, eyes wide but firm. The man looked to his companions. One shifted in the saddle. Another spat into the dirt. The leader swore under his breath, then turned his horse sharply. This ain't over. He rode off. The others followed. Their dust hung in the air a long while after they were gone. Evening fell quiet and gold. Elias looked to Morning Dove. She didn't speak. She just stepped forward, took the rifle from his arms, and leaned it back against the porch wall. You didn't shoot, she said. No. They might come again. Yes. She nodded. We'll be ready. That night, the bunkhouse fire glowed warm. Someone baked bread. Someone laughed. The carved bird still sat on the porch rail, facing outward now, not toward the house, but toward the world. The fire had taken what it wanted. But it had left something else behind. A home, born in ash. It snowed the next morning. Not heavily, just a dusting, like the sky was trying to lay a sheet over the scars left behind. Ash mixed with frost, coating the porch rails, the broken fence, the places where fire had passed like a trial. It was quiet. A holy quiet, the kind that made every footstep feel like a decision. Elias Boone stepped onto the porch and stared out at the land. The ground was black in patches. The barn roof sagged where flame had licked it. But the bunkhouse still stood. The fields beyond were gray with smoke and winter. The girls were up already. One was hanging linens, her hands red from cold. Another was sewing beside the fire, her head bowed in focus. Morning Dove stood by the well, arms crossed, hair braided tightly against the wind. She looked toward the horizon like she expected something. So did Elias. Because in Dustwater, things didn't stay quiet for long. By afternoon, the snow melted to mud. Will ruts began to form just outside the fence line. They came at sundown. 12 men this time. No sheriff among them. They came with wagons and paper, with ropes and shotguns. Their coats were buttoned, their voices loud. And behind them, like a silent jury, stood some from the town. Watching. Not speaking. Just witnessing. Elias met them halfway down the path, hat in hand, coat open, no rifle in sight. We warned you, said the man with the badge pinned too high. You refused lawful command. Elias's voice was calm. I refused a lie. They are wards of the territory. They are not cattle. They are not your burden. They are not yours to collect. The man nodded to two behind him. Take the eldest. Make the rest follow. The men moved forward. And then Elias raised his voice, not loud, but steady, like a hammer striking steel. No. The men froze. I stood by once while homes burned, Elias said, turning toward the people behind the wagons. I did what I was told. Rode where I was pointed. And when it was done, I buried a wife and a daughter and called that justice. The girls stepped into view from the bunkhouse. They didn't hide. They lined up shoulder to shoulder, behind Morning Dove. Some barefoot. Some holding kitchen knives. Some just standing tall. I lit fires once, Elias said. But I won't let another take what little light is left. The man scoffed. You're a rancher with ghosts, Boone. No, Elias said. I'm a man who finally remembered what it means to stand. The first rifle was raised. Not by Elias, but by the woman beside him. Morning Dove stepped forward, blood-stained bandage still wrapped around her palm, and placed herself between the men and the others. She's armed, one of them muttered. She wasn't. But she didn't have to be. Her body, her stillness, her choice to remain rooted there was weapon enough. The townfolk behind them began to murmur. An older woman near the wagon whispered, that one there, she saved my boy from a snakebite last year. Another man, a shopkeeper, narrowed his eyes. Boone feeds 5 mouths more than he needs. Gives them eggs and fence wood. I'd say that's more than most. The men at the front hesitated. Then a child's voice spoke. It was the youngest girl, the one who carried the cradle. She stepped from behind the bunkhouse with it in her arms, holding it out like an offering. Her face was calm. Inside the cradle wasn't a child, but letters. Folded parchment. Dozens of them. Mourning Dove took the bundle and walked it forward. She handed them to the man with the badge. What's this? Words, she said. Yours never meant much to us. Maybe these will. He opened one. Then another. Handwritten, in rough English. Misspelled, clumsy, but clear. He gave us bread when no one would. He didn't ask for our names. He just left the door open. He fixed a window. Let us sleep. He never shouted. He never touched us. He listened. He saved my sister from fire. He didn't ask if she was worth it. The man's hands began to shake. Dozens of letters. From each girl. Their testimony. Not from lawyers or preachers or men with pens. But from children who had survived a world that kept trying to forget them. The crowd behind the wagon stirred. Someone said, "Let it go." Another, "It's over." The badgeman's jaw clenched. He looked at Elias. Then Mourning Dove. Then back at the cradle. He tossed the letters into the mud. Then turned and mounted his horse. "We'll find another charge," he muttered. But no one followed. The wagons left slow. Wheels dragging through ash and meltwater. No gunfire. No ropes. Just footsteps fading. When the yard was quiet again, Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The girls began to cry then, not loudly, not messily. Just quiet tears. Mourning Dove stood beside him, hands shaking. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Elias said. "We did." He turned and saw that the porch light had stayed on through it all. That night, as the snow returned in soft flakes, Elias sat in his rocker, watching the bunkhouse windows flicker with candlelight. The cradle rested beside the door. A girl walked out and tucked a small blanket over it. It didn't matter anymore what it held. It had carried more than a child. It had carried memory. Grief. Hope. All the weight of what had been stolen and what had been rebuilt. Mourning Dove joined him on the porch, 2 cups of warm broth in hand. They drank in silence. After a long time, Elias said, "You think the town will come around?" "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not." "You staying?" "We all are." "If that's still all right." He nodded. She looked up at the lantern overhead. "You ever turn it off?" "No," Elias said softly. "Not anymore." The stars broke through the clouds above, one by one. The land stretched silent, sleeping. And on that ranch, scarred, weathered, but alive, the light stayed on. Because some homes aren't built with nails. Some are built with hands blistered from fire, with letters from the forgotten, with the stillness of a woman standing when every voice told her to kneel. Some homes begin the day a man stops bowing and lights a lantern instead.